Oh, that morning sun. Woohoo! Don't see anybody in the chat room just yet. Let me give that a test. Yeah, we got some people here. Oh, and YouTube is now live as well. All right. Wow, that sun is blinding. I don't have anything I can hang on that door. I guess I'll just have to deal with it. But note to self for next 7 a.m. thing. How y'all guys doing here? How y'all? How y'all? How y'all? How y'all? Ooh, man, that sun is blinding. Good morning. Matt Dean, how are you? Matt Dean, a local percussionist and drummer here in New London, wondering why he's watching me do a software development thing. No big deal. I'm doing good. You know, I have some symptoms of said coronavirus, but they're getting better. Of course, I haven't been tested yet because, you know, this is America. However, I do have a request into my GP to give me a referral to get tested, so I'm hoping that will happen soon. I'll be fine. Don't worry about me. I'm in isolation here in my home in southeastern Connecticut, and everything's good. All right, so hey, Paul Usher, how's it going? So we have Dev Express here in the chat rooms as well, not on Facebook, but on YouTube, and certainly they're also monitoring Twitch, I believe. So that's good. And I'm seeing Twitch and YouTube here on my screen. And if I switch over, which I probably won't be doing too much of, I'll see YouTube. So the Dev Express guys will take care of the questions on YouTube, and I will answer the ones here on Twitch and on Facebook. So what do you say, guys? We ready to go? 5 minutes, probably enough time for everybody to get acclimated. Let me see if I can't make a better filter here, chroma key filter setting, so that you don't see this stuff. But then I'll fade out. That's a little bit better. Okay, that's better. We'll use that. Become a little bit of a OBS fanatic. All right, here we go. We are going to start the Blazor Roadshow. Sorry, the Blazor Desk Show. I don't even know where I am. Welcome. So as you know, this originally started as the Blazor Roadshow. It is now the Blazor Desk Show because we're all in quarantine over this coronavirus. And we want to, desk show to code by exactly. So we wanted to not just, you know, all the momentum that we gained on this Blazor Roadshow. We went everywhere. We went all over the United States. We were planning to go to Europe. There was a lot of momentum on Twitter and just getting a lot of excitement going about Blazor. And so we decided to do it online, and that's the story. That's why we're here. And we're doing multiple dates. and times. So when we have days that we were doing the road show, it's going to be 7 a.m. Eastern time, 1 p.m. Eastern time, and 7 p.m. Eastern time, so that we can accommodate people all over the world. All right, so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to share everything I know about Blazor and prepare to drink from the fire hose because it's going to be a lot of information. However, the hands-on lab and this slideshow are all available at blazordeskshow.com. I really hope that you've gone there. If you haven't, go there now. You can download the code, and you can also download this. Check this out. Yeah, not that exactly, but if you go up here to Blazor Roadshow, there's this deep dive into server-side Blazor and all the stuff that I originally wrote for my hands-on lab. This is essentially a hands-on lab to build everything that I'm building right here is included in the materials. Okay? So I'll be showing that in a little bit. And you also get the slideshow in PDF format. So let's talk about Blazor. What is it? Blazor started out as Steve Sanderson's brainchild. He saw that WebAssembly was this up-and-coming and amazing technology that is built into all the web browsers. And by all of them, I mean all web browsers that are currently in active development. Internet Explorer 11 has, of course, been left by the wayside, and a lot of companies are still using that because it has been, it is not advanced, and it still supports some older features that their software might be using, but it doesn't support WebAssembly. Anyway, Steve Sanderson said, well, that we should be able to do C# as a WebAssembly, run it in the browser. And he got this little project together and showed it at NDC Oslo a few years ago, and people went nuts. And we all saw the potential of what this means. And I'm jumping right down to this point right here. Blazor is not Silverlight, because this is the first thing people say is like, oh, okay, I had a good friend say to me, Silverlight and Flash died for a reason. Yeah, it wasn't because it was C#. It was because it was using the plugin model. WebAssembly, totally different. Great support across the industry for WebAssembly. Anyway, as they were working on Blazor at Microsoft, they kind of thought to themselves, well, there's a component model here. And not only is there a component model that we can sort of redefine how web components are built and used, but this model will work in two different hosting models. The client side, which is the WebAssembly side that we all got excited about at first, but then we can also run these on the server. And it's important to know that you can take the same markup in code and run them on the client, in the browser, WebAssembly, or on a server. And that server-side Blazor is really magic. And as you'll see when I show you what's going on here, it is kind of magical. You can't combine hosting models, nor would you want to. So, I mean, yes, you have code that runs on the server, but if you're running a WebAssembly version of Blazor, the code that runs on the server is going to be what? APIs, right? So that's how you communicate with servers, just like you would if you were running JavaScript. But this is a UI framework, right? Think of React, Vue, Angular. I mean, it is that same thing. It's about binding and getting data into the UI and pulling data out of the UI. So therefore, you really have to pick a horse and go with it. And I'm going to show you the details of all the differences between these two models. That's exactly what we're going to do. So if you want to run Blazor, if you want to create Blazor server projects, you can do that very easily just by running the latest version of Visual Studio. You don't even need professional or enterprise. In fact, Visual Studio 2019 Community works just fine. And .NET Core 3.0 comes with everything you need to do Blazor server side. But if you want to do Blazor client, right now you need to install the .NET Core SDK 3.1, and you also need to install a Blazor WebAssembly template. And there's a link here where, and if you just go to the Googles and the Bings and type in getting started with Blazor, they will show you right there how all that stuff works. So the magic behind the hosting model for server is SignalR. Okay, there's no HTML, there's no HTTP client requests. You're not making calls over port 80 and getting data back and having to do the plumbing and stuff. The plumbing is actually all done for you. And that's why I had that magic thing in there. The means by which this happens is kind of magical. SignalR is essentially establishing a persistent WebSocket between the browser and the server. And here's the model right here. We'll just blow it up. So the SignalR hub that's built in to .NET Core for Blazor isn't something that you can poke around with. It's there that you can actually watch and log the traffic that goes over it, but it's not something that you're going to use for your own SignalR kind of things. And SignalR has typically been used, all the demos anyway, are like for chat rooms, right, where you've got one-to-many kind of distribution of messages. So like, your client would connect to a hub and say, send a message. And then the message would be sent to every other client from that hub. So that's where SignalR is really good, in this one-to-many kind of diffusion of messages. But that's not how we're using it here. We're using it as a one-to-one. So the hub essentially just is your server app. Your Blazor server app has a hub, and it just communicates back and forth with that one client over that hub. So let's just do a quick little demo here. And I'm going to have to go. I just got to do a couple of things here. Turn on a few thingamajiggers. All right, there we go. So we're in Visual Studio 2019. I'm going to create a new project. It's a Blazor app. And I'm just going to call it, Blazor server. And so this will be a server-side Blazor app. You can see I have the choice to do one or the other here. And I'm also going to install Zoom It here, which I didn't do. So now I can zoom in and I can say, the Blazor server app, or a Blazor WebAssembly app if you have the template, but we're just going to stick with the Blazor server app. I'm actually going to show you what's going on behind the hood, under the hood, behind the scenes. There's in every single Blazor server app, you get this template that has this counter page. And I'll just run this and show you what it is. So here's the counter page. I click the button, it says click me. And you can see that counter is incrementing, right? And look at the code here. This is HTML. We have a button, and we have an @onClick directive here. Now that means it's a Blazor onClick. If I take that out and just use the regular onClick equals whatever, now the browser's going to see that, and it's going to look for a JavaScript function called onClick. But this is server side. So in the server side Blazor, you get this script, Blazor server JS. By default, this is essentially all the stuff that intercepts the DOM requests. All right. So what's going on here is, let's do the whole, and you can see I've got an increment count and I've got a current count, which is being displayed with the razor syntax right there. The interaction is I click the button, okay? That Blazor JavaScript says, oh, that's an @onClick. That means we need to tell the server via signal R that the user has clicked on that button. All right, on the server, it says, well, I need to run increment count, so it executes this method, which updates this value. And now because that value is being displayed in the DOM, right, through a single binding right there, a one-way binding, it sends a message back to the browser that says this DOM element has changed, and then the DOM is updated. So one thing you don't see here is any goo, any web goo, right? You don't see any HTTP requests, and you don't have to do AJAX calls and get the result. Like, this is web programming without JavaScript. Everybody okay with that? Just show of hands. Anybody okay with the potential of leaving JavaScript behind? I find that when I ask this question, we're talking about developers who maybe never really got into JavaScript for one reason or another. Isn't because they're not smart. It's just because I find that a lot of enterprise developers especially just want to get shit done. And going down the rabbit hole of JavaScript means learning, let's face it, I mean, if you're going to be a good JavaScript programmer, you have to not only learn the tools, which is fine, everybody can learn NPM and all that, but then you have these stacks and you have these tribes of different libraries and things that you can put in, and it just becomes overwhelming for a lot of developers, and you're drowning in plumbing code. And that's I can tell from your reaction that this is a good thing. Yeah, new framework every 2 weeks. No thanks. Exactly. That's what it feels like. All right, so one of the cool things I'm going to show you right now is the signal R traffic. Let's actually watch and see what happens when we press this counter button. Now what I'm going to do is press F12 to bring up the network tools. I'm going to disable the cache. See right there, I've disabled the cache. And then I'm going to click on the record button. And I'm going to press Control F5 to reload everything here. So let's see what we got. Well, first of all, we've only got 423K downloaded. All right, so very, very small amount of data. And you know what? I'll turn off these logos here. Very small amount of data has been transferred over just initially. Also, check this out. _Blazor $ID equals blah, blah, blah. All right, that is the signal R traffic. And if I show this, and let me just clear all the messages and click, this is the data that is being sent as binary messages over Signal R. That's not a whole lot, right? I mean, granted, it's just a click, and there wasn't a lot of data that came down. But that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a very efficient way, to do AJAX calls, essentially, without having the goo of AJAX. It all is done for you behind the scenes. So that's very telling right there. All right, let's get back to our slideshow here. So this is exactly what I was just telling you. If you want to take a look at how to do advanced logging of SignalR traffic, in other words, take a look at the messages themselves, you can check out this blog post of mine where I show you how to log the SignalR traffic. Okay? So let's talk about scale. Scaling. So memory is perhaps the biggest constraint you're going to have, because if you think about it, you've got a server app. It's essentially a .NET Core 3.0 ASP.NET application, right? And it has to have a certain amount of overhead for every single concurrent client. In fact, they found with their measurements that it needs 85K minimum. That's without your data. 85K minimum of data per client for every connection. And a persistent connection or a concurrent connection is defined as one where the SignalR circuit, let's say, is connected, and that persistent connection is being maintained. So therefore, if you want to conserve memory, you want to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of like allowing your user to select millions of rows of data, or even 10,000 rows of data, say in a list or something like that, and then allow them to filter it on the client. That's not what you do. You do the filtering on the server. And essentially the way you do that is by not starting with a giant list. So you would start, with maybe 20 items or something like that, and then you could filter. You could do paging. You can do virtual stuff. If you're using the Dev Express controls, for example, they have the ability to do paging and virtual, one page at a time for both list boxes and grids. The other constraint is WebSockets. And WebSockets, the number of WebSockets is limited by memory and by CPU. And if you want, you can use Azure SignalR service to take the WebSocket, the SignalR stuff, completely out of the server's memory footprint. And there's a link right there to an article. Actually, it's a GitHub README, a sample that shows you how to do that. So SignalR service obviously scales indefinitely, depending, of course, on how much money you have. All right, so this is a slide that I stole from Daniel Roth. By the way, he's going to be here tonight at He's going to be here tonight at our 7 p.m. Session. So they did a test for good. They did a test for appropriate latency, which is less than 200 milliseconds under load, with concurrent clients to see how many clients they could support. 7 p.m. Eastern, Surly Dev. It's all on blazor-show.com. Okay, so the whole idea is that they had a real application, and this one had almost 200K of memory required per concurrent client. I think it was 165, they said. But it was a real application. It wasn't just a button click. So with a server that had one virtual CPU and 3.5 gigs of RAM, they could support easily 5,000 concurrent active users. If they bump that up to 4 CPUs and 14 gigs of RAM, they could support 20,000. So this is without using SignalR, Azure SignalR service. This is just what's in the box. So there you go. Let's talk about the benefits and the drawbacks of this hosting model, the server-side hosting model. The benefits, well, download size is significantly smaller than a Blazor WebAssembly app, and the app loads much faster. That's true. You've seen that. Well, we haven't actually seen WebAssembly yet, but we will next. The app is running on the server, so you have all of the, anything that runs in Visual Studio. You have anything that runs on the .NET platform that you can use, ASP.NET Core. It all works on the server. You also have Visual Studio debugging. Currently, the Visual Studio debugging isn't enabled in WebAssembly, Blazor WebAssembly, but that is coming very soon. We'll ask Dan about that tonight. Thin clients, so any kind of mobile device or older mobile device that has a web browser that maybe doesn't support WebAssembly, it's going to work just fine. And also, this is important for some people, but I don't think it's an issue, but the code isn't sent to the browser. It's all on the server. And so some people are, concerned about code running in the browser. My take on that is, well, JavaScript runs in the browser too. So the thing is, you're not going to run any kind of secret code in the browser, just like you wouldn't with JavaScript. That's what APIs are for. All right, the downsides. Excuse me. The downsides. You have a little bit of latency between, button click and seeing the result. The added latency is what you have of having to go round trip through that SignalR hub. The code runs on the server, of course. You're going to have that when you're getting data anyway. But this is just for UI, basic UI interaction. You have to go round trip. Ah, good. Finally, I can get out of the sun. All right. There's no offline support. Your app is either working or it's not working. So if the connection goes down, you're pooched until it comes back up. And the scalability issues I already mentioned, scaling up memory, scaling up SignalR by getting it out of the box. Those things need consideration. And you also do need a server just for basic UI interaction. So whereas you could take HTML and JavaScript or even Blazor client, WebAssembly Blazor, you could just take all that stuff and ship it off to a CDN. It doesn't require a server in order to be instantiated and running. So any questions on the server-side model before we move on? Anyone? Bueller? Anyone? I'll wait because, there is a lag. I want to make sure we get your questions out of the way. Aside from the connection being SignalR, what's the difference between this and web forms? Oh, wow. All right, well, web forms, first of all, is based on .NET, not .NET Core. So you have that performance increase. Also, the web forms, you still had to do plumbing, except that it was hidden from you too. But the difference is that the state, and this is something that I didn't mention, the state is passed back and forth in web forms with that view state, right? It's like this serialized string that represents the DOM, essentially. And what's going on here is that the server keeps a sort of a graph of the client DOM in memory, because everything, the UI completely comes from the server. It knows, what's going on in the DOM. And so that the anytime a request is made, and like the increment count, for example, is run, the server notices that there's a change in the DOM, and it takes a diff, or the difference between, before it applied the code and after, and whatever those changes are, it just sends those messages down to the client, to the browser, and the browser updates. So, I mean, in a sense, it's very similar, except that, think of it sort of like if you had to do web forms all over again with Ajax, instead of replacing the page on every call, which is what we do with web forms. That's the big difference. It's the same idea in that it's hiding all the plumbing from you, right? And you can just focus on the code. But it's way different in terms of efficiency. I mean, look, you saw how little data was going back and forth right there. If that was a web forms application, the entire DOM would have had to have been serialized and sent for each click request. And, that's just a lot of unnecessary traffic. So yeah, and as Don says here, you'll see that very soon, that the difference, especially when I show WebAssembly. Okay, let's move on. Client-side hosting model. So for the client-side hosting model, it's pretty easy. Everything just runs in the browser. So let me talk about WebAssembly for a minute. WebAssembly, as I said before, is a standard virtual machine that is running in every browser that is modern and current. And that includes Safari. It includes Safari on iPhone. Look, I mean, I have an iPhone, and I've been able to run, WebAssembly client stuff on there, no problem. So, and it's not just WebAssembly isn't just a Microsoft thing. In fact, it's not a Microsoft thing. Other languages run on WebAssembly, including Rust and Golang, Python, and all sorts of languages. Everybody wants to be in WebAssembly, right? So it's not just a Microsoft thing. The difference between Blazor client and other languages, most other languages, is that, all right, so it's a VM. So think of it like, Windows or whatever. So if you have a Windows executable, you have to have that Windows operating system underneath it in order to support it. So this is a virtual machine, and it's cross-platform, all right? So you have to have at least something that is compiled for WebAssembly in order to run. With Golang, with Rust, with all these other things, they compile directly to WebAssembly. They do a conversion from whatever and compile directly to WebAssembly and then run as a binary. But the thing that runs as a binary with Blazor is the CLR, the Common Language Runtime. And so they've created a small common language runtime, just like they did with Silverlight, right? A small common language runtime that is going to run on WebAssembly. And then everything else is just assemblies. So in fact, it will run, you can run any .NET Standard 2 .NET code, right? Anything that's .NET Standard 2.0 will run in WebAssembly. So there's a big difference there. Let's do the same thing that I did before with watching the traffic, but we'll now create a WebAssembly project. All right, so we're back in Visual Studio, and I'm going to add to this solution a new project, also a Blazor app. I'll call it Blazor WASM. WASM is short for WebAssembly, if you hadn't figured that out. So this time I'm going to choose a WebAssembly app, and I'm also going to check off this guy right here, ASP.NET Core hosted. If you don't do that, you do get a WebAssembly application, but you only get what's going to run in the browser. Question, what is the status on this model release-wise? The status is that it'll be baked in May. I mean, I'm going to have to ask Dan tonight if anything's changed, but because of the coronavirus and people, working at home or whatever. But last time I checked, it's going to be baked. In other words, it won't change after the release in May. And then it will be shipped as part of .NET 5 in November. So May, I imagine that's around the time of build, but I'm only guessing. And then on November, .NET 5, which is core, everything converging in one .NET, cross-platform, everything. All right, so we're going to, what you do get if you check off this ASP.NET Core hosted thing is you get a server that serves the client app. And so therefore it's in the same URL space, so you can have controllers in there that you can call directly without having to, use cores, cross-origin, resource, all of that stuff. So that's kind of nice. So you get both. You get a server where you can have your controllers, and then you have a client that can call in to get those controllers. You also get a shared project, and the shared project is where models would go, let's say. And the shared project is just a class library right there, Blazor WASM shared. So here's the server with the controllers, right, that serves up the client that is going to run in the browser. Follow me? Okay, good. So all I'm going to do is I'll make essentially the Blazor WASM server, the startup project, which will serve up the WebAssembly app. Make that the startup. Okay, so cool. I'm going to do the same thing I did before. Oh, and by the way, both of these have this these 3 pages, both server side and client side. When you load up an app, they have these 3 pages. One fetches some data, one is the counter, and one is just a static hello world page. So let's open the counter, and I'm even going to I'm going to open this in an incognito page. I don't want any possibility of caching anything. So I'll open up again the network page, start recording, and press Control F5. And now let's see what we get. Well, that's a little different, isn't it? Let's see here. 2.1 megabytes transferred. That expanded, and that was compressed. It expanded into 4.5 megabytes. Anybody got a problem with 2.1 megabytes? An initial download of assemblies, right? Only happens once. Then it goes into your browser cache. But does anybody have a problem with that? Well, if you do, consider Gmail, 5 megabytes. Anybody use Angular? Yeah, it turns out that all of these UI frameworks have some overhead. But let's take a look at some of these other things right here. Where's the one I'm looking for in particular? Well, I don't see it, but let's sort by size. There it is right there. Right up at the top. .NET WASM. Anything with a WASM extension is a binary WebAssembly file. And so this is the CLR. Here's your mono-based cross-platform CLR compiled for WebAssembly. That happens to be the largest file in this collection here. Now look at the rest of them are just, I mean, you've got a JavaScript file here, but the rest of them are just assemblies. That's it. I mean, here's a CSS file, right? So that's a little different. Now, check this out. When I increment the counter, and you can see it's incrementing here, right? When I increment the counter, there's no additional traffic. Why? Because it's running in the browser. Different. Big difference. And as I said before, there's no, let me do this. Go to Solution Explorer. If I go to my client pages, for example, and I click here and try to put a breakpoint there, it doesn't work. Now there are tricks to use the browser debugging tools. If you attach to the process and if you Google it, you'll find that. But very, very soon, there's a new refresh coming. I don't know if it's going to be before May, coming in April. I don't know when it is, and they said in that the next version essentially that they release, they'll have debugging in Visual Studio. But I'm going to show you a trick so that you can do it today, right now, today. So, pluses and minuses of the client-side model. On the plus side, the code executes more quickly in the browser because you don't have that extra hop of signal R to add latency. You do get offline support, right? So if I downloaded this WebAssembly application and then killed my network, I could still update the counter. What I couldn't do is fetch the weather data because that's calling an API. However, if you use the progressive web application framework and create a manifest and do all that stuff, there's actually even Blazor components that you can just add to your project right now, and it'll become a PWA. You can do offline support, so you can say which resources are cached and calls to the server that get cached, that kind of thing. You can also distribute this stuff with a CDN if you want to. And as I said before, any .NET Standard 2 code will run in the browser. So the downsides. Unlike in Blazor Server, you can't directly access a database or any other API that requires secrets because you don't want secrets shipped to the browser. So you have to make an API layer. And the database call is the classic one of these, right? If I'm in Blazor Server and I want to populate a list or a grid with data or something like that, I don't have to make an API layer. I can just call into my database. I don't have to because I'm already on the server. But if you're in the browser, yes, you do. You have to make an API call. So there's an extra layer required if you're doing a WebAssembly app. As I said, debugging in Visual Studio still not baked. Already told you that it's in preview until May and then shipping with .NET 5. And as I said before, your code is shipped to the client. I'm not so sure this is a big deal. When we were on the Blazor Roadshow, we were in New York, and somebody from FinTech was like, well, we're in finance, and we don't want our code going in the browser. Anybody can just look at it. And I said, yeah, but they can do that with JavaScript. And he said, Well, then I just run it in Node. I'm like, yeah, okay. So anything that's you don't want running in the browser, you run somewhere else, like in an API, right? Or a long running process or some other server side or cloud process that runs in Azure. You just don't run it on the client. It's the same boat. You're in the same boat as JavaScript. You're sandboxed. So, same security model that JavaScript enjoys. Any questions on the WebAssembly model? We'll just pause for a few minutes here, make sure everybody's got time to ask a question. Anyone? Bueller? Bueller. So I'm hoping now you see the benefit of the model, the Blazor component model. And you will see even more benefits once we start doing events and binding, which is the next thing. It's just absolutely freaking amazing. Anyone have any questions on the WebAssembly hosting model? Which hosting model do I prefer or suggest? All right, well, so it depends, right? If I was writing enterprise software and I was writing it for, business to business or even just for our enterprise behind the firewall or whatever, and I knew that the people using it had a real network connection that wasn't going to go down. In other words, it wasn't something that we were going to put out on the internet. I would use the server model because it's easier, and if you have the resources to scale it up, right? So I would start with, can I get away with using the server model? That's probably the question you want to ask first, because it's a lot easier to develop. One person can be both front end and back end. One system. You don't have you could still have people who work on the UI, but essentially it's one project, right? So the other thing to consider is that this is a SPA framework, a single page application framework. And like all single page application frameworks, they don't fare well with search engine optimization. So it's very hard for search engines to reach in and get data that's on pages, because these things are dynamic and the data changes all the time. So if you're developing an application that you are expecting people to find either by Google, Bing, or other search engines, then a SPA in general isn't a good idea. But if you're building something that, again, B2B, B2C, then you have options. The best approach to manage state. Yes, I will be talking about that in just a few minutes. All right, I think I'm going to move on. This is good. You guys liking this? All right, let's talk binding. And then we'll talk state. So binding is really, really simplified in this component model. And you'll see, I'm actually not going to read this slide to you. It's here for reference. But instead, I'm going to just show you what binding is all about. All right, let's go back to my VM here. And I actually have all this code in here for you to play with later. But I'm going to go back to my server as the startup project, Blazor server. Let me close all this so I don't get confused. And we'll go to our index page. All right, so let's talk binding. Oh, yeah, okay. All right, I'm doing this out of order. All right, so let's do a little two-way binding. You've already seen one-way binding with that counter thing. And this is actually a two-way bound message. So here we have an input tag. Okay? We're binding the default property of the input tag, which is value, to this message property. Okay? And this is perhaps the simplest binding syntax there is. I don't have to specify the property if I want to bind to the default property. All right? And with an input tag, it's value. So the first thing I'm showing here is in a header tag, I'm just showing the message. There's our one-way binding. And then I can change the message. Two-way means I can use input to change it. So here I'll say changed. Now, it doesn't change until I actually lose focus. So I'm going to press tab here. Boom. And now the onChanged event happens, which happens to be the event, the default event that updates the UI, that forces a UI refresh. Okay? So that's why it didn't happen until I hit tab. I have to lose focus in order for that change event to fire. However, I can change the event that forces the change. All right, I can do that by saying app bind :event equals, and I'll change it to on input, which means now anytime there's an input change, in other words, key press, that will force a refresh of the UI. So it's that easy. Very, very simple. Now, if I wanted to be more explicit, I could say bind value, and I could say at bind value event, right? This is expressing exactly the property that we're binding to. Should work exactly the same way. Okay. Now let's talk about a component. I'm going to create a component called child component right here. And this is how you add your own components, like either a page or a component that you would consider like a custom control, right? So I'm going to add a new item. It'll be a razor component. I'll call it child component. And here's the here's the content of this component. So as for markup, I've got a div here. And I've put a little padding around it and changed the background color to light gray. That's just to show us that this is actually the component UI. I'm displaying the parent message, which is a property. It's also specified as a parameter. So you can think of parameters as public properties exposed by a component. And those parameters can have default values, so then when you instantiate the component, you can specify what those parameters are, the parameter values. This is how we do events. Look at this. A parameter, that's an event callback of a particular type. That type is what we're passing when we raise the event. And this is how we do it with await message changed, which is the name of our event callback, dot invoke async, and then pass whatever you want to it. In this case, we're passing the parent message. So what we're doing here is we have this update message that the button is going to call on click, right, to change the message from this parent message from within the component, and then raise the event passing that message back up to the parent, essentially index page. So let's modify this to instantiate that component. All right, this is all the same. We're binding the message we have here, and the event is on input, but we've got this child component. And we can specify the binding directly to, did I say child component? No. There we go. I just erased it, sorry. So we're specifying here that we want to bind the parent message property of this child component to our message property, and we want the event that triggers a change for parent message to be message changed. Now that's in the component. All right, so what we're saying here is anytime message changed happens, update our message. I don't even have to have a handler for it. I mean, it could, but I don't have to, because all I'm going to do is bind it to one of my properties. So here we go. What's going on here? This didn't instantiate. I'm in the right one, right? Blazor server, index razor, yeah. All right, something happened here. Yeah, it is child component. Div, parent message. Same component that ran when we were on the road, John. I don't know what's going on here, huh? Put something below it. Yeah, not showing up. Don't know why. That was an awesome demo. Just going to spend a little more time looking at this while you guys ask questions, and maybe Don can answer them. Oh, I see. I see. I have two. I knew it. I knew it had to be a spelling thing. I spelled it with two L's. Here we go. Stupid idiot. All right. All right. I am updating in the component. Right? So as I type here, we have our, just as before, our one-way binding that shows. But we also have a one-way binding inside the component, right? Now if I click this, it's going to change this in the component, which bubbles up to the parent. Isn't that cool? Very cool. All right, so that's my binding demo. Let's go back to here and talk about state. That's a really good question. Would an error have shown up anywhere as a result of that spelling mistake? That's a, yeah, I didn't see any warning in Visual Studio. And maybe, yeah, I don't know. No, I didn't see any warning at all. That was really kind of surprising, wasn't it? So state is essentially, I mean, if you're talking about what you already know, probably web forms, you're thinking session. We really have to talk about state on the server-side model. State on the client-side model, well, you know, all your code is running on the client, so you just have to figure out a way to persist things that you want to persist. But essentially, the browser is the state. You don't need to keep state between, you know, calls, UI calls, because it's just there. But if you want to persist something so that it's there the next time you run the application, then you have to do some persistence. But when we talk about state, we're really talking about server-side state, okay? So here's what happens. Every time you navigate to one of those pages, say home, counter, you know, fetch data, every module level or page level variable gets zapped. It gets reinitialized. So the whole page is reinitialized on navigation. So what you can do is anything that you want to live, any kind of data, variables, objects that you want to live outside of the page state, you can move into a scoped service or a class and just inject that class wherever you want to. Of course, you can persist and recall state with your own code. I actually wrote a shopping cart application. It's a very simple demo that shows how to persist the shopping cart data with timeout using local storage. So this will work on both client and server. And you can go there on your own dime. So let's go back to Visual Studio and talk about state. So here's my counter. And as I showed you before, I can increment the count, right? No problem. Go to another page, then come back, and it's 0 again. So let's create a little class here. We'll call it, I'm going to type very carefully, and we'll call it app state. And app state is going to have one property, counter. Now I'm going to go to my startup CS, and I'll add counter. Sorry, I'll add app state as a scoped service. So what does that mean? I mean, we see add singleton, add scoped. What's the difference? Well, a singleton has one instance that is shared among all of the clients. So in the weather forecast service, which just gets some dummy data and shows it, we don't need to have an instance per user, but a scoped service gives you one instance per user. And whether it's singleton or scoped, you just inject it and then you can use it. So let's do that. Let's inject in counter an app state object called app state. Now, inject doesn't instantiate. Inject just gives you access to whatever is there. And since we added it as a scoped service, this is always going to be that same instance. No matter what page we call it from or inject it into, we're still going to get that instance, right? So we can blow this away, this current count 0. And I will instead change that to app state counter. And up here, we'll show app state counter. Just completely take that value out of the page and move it into a scoped service. Yeah, I'm surprised too that Visual Studio didn't complain. We'll ask Dan about that tonight. All right, here, same thing. I'm incremented 3 times. If I go to home now or fetch data, come back to counter, and it's still 3. Now, if I had done this as a singleton, what would happen? User 1 would change it to 3. User 2 would come into the counter page, and it would be 3. So you want to use scoped services to handle state. That's the moral of the story. Okay, now I'm going to show you something so cool you're not even going to believe it. Remember I told you that Visual Studio, you can't be used to debug WebAssembly applications. That's true today. However, you can do this if you develop both a server and a client app simultaneously using, sorry, my nose itches, using only the markup and code from the WebAssembly project. This is a trick I learned from Steve Sanderson at NDC London in January. What you do is you have both the WASM and the server project in the solution like I do now. You add a reference from the server app to the WASM app, and then you change the app reference in the server to the client app. Okay, so it's a little bit complex, yes. Let me show you the code. Okay, so here we have the server app. We're going to add a reference to my Blazor WASM client and Blazor WASM shared. All right, both of these. Now we're going to go into the underscore host CS HTML page. All right, this is sort of the initial HTML layout page that contains your app in this right here. This is the entirety of your markup and code right there. That app object. So, because all the rest of this is just some error stuff and JavaScript and links and all of that, this is everything, including the nav bar, all of that. So I'm going to change the reference here instead of my local app object to Blazor WASM client app. I'll change the render mode to server. And now I'm going to show you how confident I am that this is going to work. I'm going to delete these pages from my server app. They will no longer be there. And finally, I'm going to go to the solution properties and select multiple startup projects. I want to start my Blazor server app, and I also want to start the WASM app. See there? Those two. So now we're going to have two browser windows. I'm going to rebuild the solution because if you don't do that, some weird things could happen. And it's done. So now we'll run this. And yes, I do have two browsers. Let me run them side by side. Now you can tell which is which by looking in the title bar. I'm sorry, the title of the page itself. That's Blazor Server. Even though it says Blazor WASM at the top, go all the way to the top and see Blazor Server. And that's Blazor WASM. And I'm talking like right there. Okay. So let's go to our Blazor WASM because this is where the code actually is. And you can see everything's working just fine. Now we'll go over to Blazor Server and I can see, now remember I deleted this page. So this is absolutely the same code that's running. It's the client code, but it's running on the server. So take a look at what I can do here. I'm in Blazor WASM client. I go to pages. I go to counter razor. I put a breakpoint right there. Remember, this is WASM code. When I click, boom, I can debug it. Yes, I can. However, I'm debugging it on the server, so you're not really seeing the effect of what's going on in the client. And if there's an error that happens on the client that doesn't happen on the server, you know, you'll have to use the browser tools to debug that. But, you know, basic code, basic debugging is right there. All right, now interestingly, what happens when I go to fetch data? Boom, an unhandled exception has occurred. See browser dev tools for details. Yeah, that's something that I want to encourage my users to do, is to go hit F12 and find out what my bugs are. But let's actually look and press F12 and see what the error was. So here's the problem. Cannot provide a value for property HTTP on fetch data. There's no registered service of type SystemNet HTTP client. And that is actually by design, because on the interesting thing here is that why did it happen on the client, not on the server? Well, in the client, the environment, right, is set by on the server, the startup, right? This sets the environment. And on the client, we have included an HTTP client. And you can see in fetch data, it's injecting HTTP client right there. But there is no reference on the server to HTTP client because we didn't need it. We were actually calling this weather forecast service directly because we're on the server, right? So we didn't need an HTTP client. So what we have to do on the server side is add one. Hey now. All right, so that gets us to there where we have the HTTP client. Now let's see if that's enough to make this work. All right, that's the WASM version. Here's the server version. Fetch data, boom, I still have a problem. But this is a different problem now. Now the problem is it doesn't understand what that URL is. All right, it doesn't understand where it wants me to go fetch the data from. So let's actually look at the code in fetch data. Well, yeah, here's the problem. I have my HTTP, right? But that's the URL that it's going to. Now, on the client, that makes sense because we're in the same, we're calling into that Blazor WASM server that has the controller on it right here, right? And it's in the same URL space. So I don't need to specify a complete URL. But I do need to if I'm calling it on the server, because the server doesn't have another server in its URL space, right? It would be asking for a controller on the Blazor server. So let's find out what the URL is. If I go to launch settings JSON for my Blazor WASM server, where my API is, I can see the SSL port is 44372. So let's just change this URL to https localhost :44372 /weather forecast. Make it an absolute URL. And now I think we're out of the weeds. Questions on this? It's pretty cool, isn't it? There it is. And of course, that same URL is going to work on the client side as on the server side. So the moral of the story here is you have to have the same resources in the environment. All right, so that includes the services that you have access to, the NuGet packages that you have installed, right? And also JavaScript. We'll talk about JavaScript interop in a minute. But you have to have all of those environment resources available at the place where the code is going to be executed. Okay? Even though the code itself is shared. Questions on this whole crazy process of developing these applications simultaneously? I think I've had enough coffee now. Switch to H2O. Will the app reference change in May? Well, in May, you won't have to do this. This is a trick, right? To be able to build both client and server apps and test them, you know, in the same go, right? So I don't know if the app reference will change in May, but if your goal is just to be able to debug, then by May you should be able to debug WebAssembly applications in Visual Studio. Good stuff, huh? All right, shall we move on? Or does anybody else have a question? Well, if anybody does, Don will be able to answer it for you. All right, so now I'm going to show you an example of a complex application that I developed for my first Blazor online workshop, which is a hands-on full-day workshop. We have this application. I'm going to show off some features of Blazor with this application, but essentially it came out of a necessity because I'm a musician and I have a 10-piece band, and getting 10 people together for a rehearsal is like herding cats. Try booking a gig. Booking a gig is impossible because everybody wants to do it by email. And so, you know, I have to keep a spreadsheet of who's on what gig. It's kind of a pain. So I wanted to, when, you know, Blazor server was coming out, I wanted to build something that I could, I could learn Blazor with and exercise all the pieces of it, and at the same time build something that I could use for the band. So this is essentially a way that musicians can log in and we can define gigs, and I can say I want these instruments on here and contact the musicians with a button push by email, send them a link. They would log in, say, yes, I can play that gig, or no, I can't play that gig, and here's why. So in the big version of this, which you can get with the hands-on lab at blazor.appvnext.com right now, we have these 5 models, but I'm limiting the demo version to instruments and musicians, just for simplicity's sake. So here's what we're going to learn. Code behind. So you notice right now I've got markup and code in the same Razor page. Well, you can move the code out to a class file. That's the whole idea there. You get the full power of Visual Studio editing, the refactorings and everything that you can't do in a Razor page. I'm going to show you validation, the built-in validation controls, which we're using validation based on attributes on the class themselves. Classes. JavaScript interrupt, so how you could call into JavaScript from C#. And I'm also going to touch on generic components, which are components that don't have data types built into them directly, but instead allow you to define what those data types are, and then how would you work with data when you don't know what the types are. So that's it. Let me pull up Band Booker online here. We can get rid of this guy now. Here's, oh, that's the wrong one. Let's pull it up. So Band Booker. This is the complete version. And I've got authentication in here. Oh, I might as well talk about authentication before I show you this. The authentication and authorization that we're using in here is using ASP.NET Core Identity. We're using API controllers to both register and to log in and log out. The login issues a JOT token, which is then stored in local storage, on wherever, if you're on the server side or client side, doesn't matter. And I got this technique from Chris Sainty, who wrote this awesome blog post. And Chris Sainty is an MVP. He writes great stuff about Blazor. Very, very cool guy and very knowledgeable. So he has blessed this my ripping off his technique. You can see a lot of his code in Band Booker, just specific to Band Booker. But if you want to read the generic article, there it is. All right, so let's go back to Visual Studio. And I'm just going to run this first so that you can see what all is, what it's supposed to do, what it looks like. And then we'll dive into the various pieces that I was talking about. Now, this is using the same technique of I have a server version and I have a client version, and I'm developing both simultaneously. So this code works on both WebAssembly and on the server side. So you can see I've got the ability to register and or log in. So if I log in, if I don't log in, right, if I just go home, it says please register or log in to use this app. Now I'm not doing anything with counter or fetch data. It's all on the index page. But if I'm logged in, now I can see all the stuff that I was showing you before, except that that one didn't work. Okay. Probably got the wrong credentials. Yeah, that's what it is. Let's do this again. We'll actually go and register somebody. So we're going to register Carl at carl.com. My password is going to be p@ssword1, capital P@ssword1. And if they didn't match, it would tell me here. And if I actually didn't have a real email address here, it would tell me because I have validation. Right? So we'll register. All right, well, now I'm interested. I may have taken away the database. Let's see if I did. I don't know why I would have, but the authentication is using a database that's in local DB here. Yeah, I think I did take that database away. So I'll just quickly redo it. And where is that? In data migrations, yes. So I will make sure that Ben Booker WASM server is current, and I'll say update database. So now I should have that database there. Now all I got to do is copy that name and make sure that it is correct in app settings JSON. There we go. Now we should be cooking with gas. All right, so again, we'll register. And I'll be carl@franklin.com, PASSWORD1, P@SSWORD1. There we go. Now it's asking me to log in with the same credentials. I go ahead and do that, and now we're good to go. Okay, so now getting back to what this application actually does. I have a list of instruments and a list of musicians. So this is the WASM version, obviously. So notice that edit and delete buttons are disabled until I actually select one, but I could use new. Also notice that name is in focus. This field is in focus, it's blinking. So I can just start typing. That is not something that Blazor can do by itself out of the box right now. I had to use JavaScript interop for that. This right here is a component, and of course, I use the same convention of, giving it a little margin and making it background light gray so you can tell it's a component. Now, of course, edit and delete work because we have a selected instrument, right? Now, musicians work the same way, except the musician editor is a little bit different. This one asks you to select from a list of instruments. This is my generic component here. It's called Object Picker. And that is happening within the musician editor. I've got this generic component. And the reason it's generic is because I want to reuse it in, when I have bands that have lists of musicians, I want to use that as well. So Piano Patty plays keyboards. I just double click on that, or I can go back and forth. I can move all or one. You get the idea, right? I mean, you've probably seen this UI a million times and done it yourself. But there you go. So we can update that, and that is pretty much what this UI does. It just allows us to edit and add instruments, to edit and add musicians. We'll add Che. Che plays the conga. Add him, there he goes. If I edit, you can see he still plays the conga. All right. Now let's dive into it. Let's go to index. So index, you notice, first of all, I have this authorized view. And if you are authorized, you get to see all the UI. Otherwise, not authorized, you get to see this. Please register or log in to use this app. All right? So it's very easy once you've been authenticated, like once you've logged in and we know who you are, now you can be authorized. And you can use, you can limit this to roles as well. So you can put people in different roles and then say, you're only authorized to see this particular UI, and it can be nested if you're in this particular role. So that's all doable. So here's what it takes to do a list box. All right. This is you're welcome. You're welcome. It's all good to go. This is essentially what you have. You have a select with an @on change, which happens every time you click on an item in the list. And I can also enable and disable it with this Boolean right there. And you notice that when I'm editing an instrument or a musician, the list itself is disabled, so I can't select another one. Just little things, right? And then I've got a for each that happens over here. And the for each goes through a list of instruments. And it does something different if the instrument is the selected instrument, which I set, an instrument selected. I have an instrument object. And if the selected instrument is not null and the ID matches, then I create an option with selected. Otherwise, I don't use the selected attribute. So then I have some buttons, new, edit, and delete, and I have disabling logic here too, that if this disable instrument edit button Boolean is true, then this will essentially disable the button. Here I'm defining my instrument editor instance. I've got my selected instrument, and I have handlers now. Before we were using binding with events. Now I'm using handlers, instrument canceled, instrument added. And just to show you, now we're getting into code behind. This is what a handler looks like. It's just a public void, whatever the name of the handler is, with the value that it passes. It's that easy. So with code behind, all I've got to do is create a class, and in this case, it's for index razor. So you give it the same name, index.razor.cs. And then you make it a partial class, and you inherit from Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components component base. The other caveat is that any class level variables or handlers or properties or anything like that, if they're going to be accessed from the UI, from the markup code, they have to either be protected or public. They can't be private. So there's your code behind. Musicians is the same way. I have a musician editor here. So that's pretty much for index, but pay attention to this select right here, because that's gonna come up in just a few minutes of how we can improve on that and what all is involved in it. So let's talk JavaScript. Let's look at in instrument editor, let's say. We've got, first of all, we'll talk about, we'll come back to the validation, right? But we have this JavaScript runtime injected right here, right? So this is a JavaScript interop runtime. Anytime you want to do JavaScript interop, you inject an IJS runtime. And then what happens when we say new instrument, which is something that we call from here. Look at this. On click is new instrument button click. So let's say we want to create a new instrument. We start there. Then new instrument button click awaits this new instrument method on, what is that? Instrument editor. Let's look at where that's defined. Well, that's the instrument editor component. And I have a reference to this, but how do I specify which one it is? We'll check it out. Right there. At ref equals instrument editor. Now I've got a reference to this component instance. So that's what's happening right here. So an instrument editor, we call a new instrument, and it invokes this JavaScript method setFocus. Now where is that? Well, that is in two places, because JavaScript is in the environment that the app is running. Okay, it's not part of the Blazor markup and code. So on the client side, it's in www index HTML, and on the server side, it's in _host CSHTML. So we're going to see it in both places, and I'll just show you. There it is, in both places. So what am I doing here? Why all this goo? All right, well, just come back down to internal focus right here. I've got element focus and element select. But before I can get to that, I'm exposing this window.setFocus, passes an ID, and I'm calling internal focus after 10 milliseconds. I'm calling a set timeout after 10 milliseconds, call internal focus. In internal focus, I try to get the element by ID, but it could be null. Why? Well, if it's null, then I call myself in another 10 milliseconds and return. If it's not null, I call focus and select. Now you saw how it worked. It was pretty seamless. But the reason I have to do this is because when this edit instrument gets called, the way we display the component is this show instrument panel is true. And up here, we're only showing the UI if that Boolean is true. So what has to happen is we call setFocus, but this isn't going to update the UI until we exit this method. And then it's going to take some time for the round trip and all that stuff to happen. Now, somebody asked me, why don't you just handle override, one of the events in the component model, or one of the virtual methods in the component model, which I'll show you right now, protected void on why am I not getting this? Oh, protected void override on after render. Okay, what's going on here? Why don't I get this? All right, well, anyway, there's something that you can override in the component model called on after render. And this essentially allows you to hook when the component, after the component is rendered. Why don't you just do the set focus there? Well, then it would happen every time the page refreshed. And that doesn't work. There it is. I did it in the wrong way. So on after render, right there. Now I would have to add all sorts of, logic to determine if this is when I actually want to do the, the set focus. So that didn't work. So that's why I'm doing it this way. But anyway, there's JavaScript interop for you. All right, let's go back to the edit form and the validation. So edit form is built into Blazor, and it is essentially something that you can say within this edit form, I need to do some input, some validation, and all of that stuff. On valid submit means when the validation has passed and everything's cool, call submit button pressed. So that's just like, you know, your submit button right here has been pressed right here. Data annotations validator means I want you to validate against the class in this model right here, instrument. So if we go down to instrument and look at it, I'm using system component model data annotations, and I've got name as a required field and a maximum length of 50. Name is too long. All right, so now anytime I'm editing an instrument and my name goes over 50 characters, I'm going to get a validation error. There are other data annotations that you can add, like email address, zip code, phone number, URL, you know, that kind of thing. It just makes it a lot easier to do annotations, to do validation rather. So check it out. If I go to guitar and I edit and I start going blah, 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 and notice because I have the binding set on input, boom, name is too long. Okay? So let's go back here. This validation summary is what those errors were that were shown in red. You can put it anywhere you want. I have it above. And also, instant input text. What's that? All right, well, you could use input text. Input text is an input element that has the validation stuff built into it. So this is a Blazor, the Blazor validation version of this. Okay. So there's the base class. Here's the Blazor version, and here's my version, instant input text. And I had to do this because instant input text doesn't allow me to bind the event to input on input. So I actually created a subclass of input text right there where the bind event is on input. And so now I just refer to that, instant input text. I have the ID set here, instrument name, because that's what we're going to use to do the focus. Now I got my submit button and also have a cancel button. Notice this, if you have anything any buttons other than a submit button, you have to specify them type equals button. Okay? So that is, I think, does that cover our list? Let's take a look. Code behind, oh, generic components. Yes, generic components. Let's do that. So in the musician editor, right, we're calling this object picker. Now, object picker is a generic component, and here's what makes it generic right there at the top. At type param t item. So this is our wildcard. This is our generic type t item, and it gets defined when we specify it as a parameter. And of course, I've got a code behind here. Specify it as a parameter. So here's t item selected item. Here's a list of t item, all items, and then a list of t items selected items. Go back to musician editor, and you can see My selected items are the instruments that this musician plays. I have the all items, which is a list of all instruments, because remember, you have to have all instruments on the left and selected instruments on the right. I have two text fields, item type and item type plural, and that's just for showing UI, instruments, select an instrument, whatever. And then I have the property names for the text, what I show, and the value, how I identify, right? The text property is name, and the value property is ID. And I also have a component updated event, so I can handle, whenever something has changed. So get back into Object Picker. Well, let's look at the layout first. So it's a table, all right? I have all instruments here, and then nothing in the top column, middle column, top row, and then selected instruments. And in the next row, I've got all the instruments in a select on the left. I've got my 4 buttons for add selected, add all, remove selected, remove all. And then I've got my list of selected items, right? And then all of this goo right here is to help us get values. So I have a method called item value that I pass in the item, and I just use a little reflection to get the item value. That's the ID property. And if I want to get the item text, that's the text property name. And you can see in Object Picker that I'm accessing those in the for each. So that's pretty cool. That's generic components right there. All right. Coming into the home stretch here. Just some things that you need to think about for deployment. Obviously, you're going to want to move databases to production, going to want to move credentials to config files. Don't have any, database connections in your WASM project. That's not a good idea. Change the URLs and connection strings accordingly. And then here's something. If you're deploying to Azure, watch this. You need to enable WebSockets for a server-side Blazor app. And to do that, you just go into your app service in Azure and go to the configuration properties, and enable WebSockets is just a switch, and you just turn it on, but it's off by default. Something to know. Okay. We're going to end today by talking about DevExpress free Blazor components. I know I can't get a show of hands, but if you have used DevExpress controls in the past, go ahead and send a message, let us know, so that the guys at DevExpress can get a good idea of how many people use their controls here. Just a little bit about DevExpress. First of all, a big round of applause for them bringing me out on the road and now to your desk. You can see I've got the Blazor Roadshow shirt on here. Without them, I couldn't be doing this. So they really went out on a limb here because they wanted everybody to get familiar with what's involved in developing Blazor applications, and then B, they believe that they have these great controls that they believe that they can help you. And they can help you because, as I said before, enterprise developers just want to get shit done. Pardon my French. And you saw that it's kind of complex to do some of these things that require these extra steps, JavaScript and ways to hook into the DOM, all of that stuff. So the thought of writing my own grid component or my own multi-select list box or my own scheduler or anything like that becomes really daunting. And so this is where DevExpress controls come in, because they can provide value to you. First of all, they're free right now, right? They might not be in the future, but what you can download today, you can use forever. And they do these complex things. Let me just show you. Let me show you. I'll go up here. Let's go back to. Let's go back here. I'm going to show you the demos that are online for Blazor controls, and all their demos are online, right? Check out the scheduler. Now, yes, they have grids and all that stuff, and things are fine, but look at the scheduler. This is like dropping Google Calendar into your app. This is a Blazor control, okay? So I can move things around. I can swap them on different days. You can see that it does the recursive job of making sure that they don't overlap each other. I can add, you know, I can add one here. And you've got all of the, you know, the calendars and all of that stuff here. I can save this, and I move the day. So let's not move the day, Carl. Save it. There it is right there. I might need a little extra time for coffee. Now, look at the code that's required to do what we just did. Friends, if that ain't getting stuff done, I don't know what is. I mean, that is just so flippin' easy to just drop in. Of course, they have, you know, data grids, and all of the controls can be themed and styled any way you like. You know, with all the same kind of controls and things that you would expect in a grid. I'm going to show you now a version of the band booker that these guys did with a DevExpress grid. Now, it doesn't do everything band booker does, you know, with the authorization and all that, but it has the basic CRUD steps of doing, you know, implementing new, edit, and delete, update. So here I've got an instrument guitar, and I'll just change it to guitars and update that. There it is right there. I can delete drums. I can create a new instrument. Update that. Now I can create a new musician and select the instruments the musician plays, and I'll just select a conga right there, but I can select more. Update. There he is. I edit. Those instruments are there. So it's the basic CRUD stuff that my band booker app does, and you saw all the code there. Let's look at the markup. Here's the markup for instruments. Pretty small. Here's the markup for musicians. This has got a little bit more because we have an edit form in the middle here with an edit form layout, you know, for the instruments. And now take a look at the code. This is the code for handling instruments. Here's the code for handling musicians. That's it. Pretty amazing. Now, I'm going to invite my friend and DevExpress guy, Don Weiber, to come in and show us. No, not yet. First, I want to talk about multi-select list boxes. It turns out that doing a multi-select list box in Blazor isn't easy at all. So you remember the select. Well, the select does have this, you know, multiple attribute, but the problem is that the onChanged event handler will only pass to you the thing that you've just selected. It won't pass all of the all of the items that are selected. So there isn't any way to do this in Blazor. Now, this is a single select list box. Now, I found this great blog post, and let me go into the component itself. Here it is. I found this great blog post where a guy did a multi-select list box in Blazor, and he gives away the code. His name is ASHKE98. This is from January. And so he shows you how to do this. The results of that I have put into this application here. So check it out. Here's a select multiple where we're binding and we're using multiple. This is his own component, right? And then we've got a for each item and selected book IDs. We're just showing data. So let me show you what that looks like. And here I'm illustrating what's involved. Right, here's single select. If I press Control or Shift, nothing happens. Here's the multi-select using the component that this guy built that I'm going to show you in a minute. And then I'm going to show you DevExpress, the DevExpress version. So let's look at his select multiple here. So I've got a select, and I've got a cascading value. I've got all sorts of parameters. This is a generic control, right? So you've got the type param. And I've got handlers for render, async, onChange, and we've got this JavaScript invocable. So he's actually invoking this from JavaScript, right? So look at the JavaScript that's involved here. All this JavaScript is required in order to handle a multi-select list box. That's a lot of stuff, right? So can it be done better? I think so. And to bring that up here is Don, and I totally pronounced his last name wrong, Don W. from Amsterdam. Hey, Don.
Hey, Carl. That was a decent amount of work getting that multi-select feature enabled. But fortunately, there are easier ways of doing so by using the native DevExpress Blazor controls. And let me show you how simple that works. I have this page over here, and I have only prepared this property which will hold the selected books of the list box. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to insert the DevExpress list box here, where I will bind the data to the book service, and I'll specify a text field name, which will be in this case the property name, which will be displayed inside the list box. And then the last thing is I'm going to bind the selected items of the list box to the selected books property of the page. And this is basically all we need right now. Let me also include the code that you've seen before. There is one difference though, and that is instead of cycling through this list with IDs and stuff, you can now cycle directly through the selected books collection. And you can write out those property names straight away. So it's again a bit less code here. And once I run the application, let's see what happens now. If I go to the DevExpress demo, what we'll see is that we have the same UI as we had on the previous pages. The only thing right now is that if I hold down the Shift key or the Control key, it still selects one. Well, and that's actually quite simple solved because right now the list box is in single selection mode. If I go back to the code and I'll add a property which I will change to the list box selection mode multiple, we're all set. So let's run a demo again, and I will now be using my control and my shift key as well. And what you'll see is I can select items individually or deselect them, or I can even hold the shift key to select the whole batch.
Nice.
So that's quite simple, huh?
Mm-hmm.
And there is one more thing I'd like to show, and that is setting another property. And that property is gonna be show checkboxes. I'm gonna put it to true, and now all of you may guess what this will do. So let's run it again, and what we have now is a really nice list box with checkboxes. And for single selections, I don't even need to hold down the control key, but I can still use the shift key if I want. So if I want to select the whole batch, I'll just hold down the shift. So a very nice and powerful control.
Yeah.
And yeah, if we check the amount of code that was needed to get this desired UI, I would say this is too much, right?
Right. Well, Don, thanks for that great demo.
You're welcome, Carl, and we'll talk later.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So thanks, Don, again. And we really want you to check out these components. They are free, as I said, for now. You can use them forever, the ones that you download right now. You can run the DevExpress Blazor demos online just by going to devexpress.com, click on Blazor demos, or you can download and run them locally. And to use them, you just install the NuGet package from your private NuGet feed, which you have to configure, but it's really easy. Modify the host CSHTML or the index HTML to include the link to their CSS, and use using DevExpress Blazor, and you're off to the races. So here are some links to things on the DevExpress website that you might be interested in. The Blazor roadmap, where you can keep up with the latest developments. The portal, where you can see blog posts from the team and new discoveries. And of course, if you want to get in touch with us, you can email blazorroadshow@devexpress.com or blazordeskshow@devexpress.com or just blazor@devexpress.com. We want to hear from you. And go get your free copy today at devexpress.com/freeblazor. We'd like you to really go there, put these things through the test, and give us some feedback and tell us what you like and what you don't like. Okay? Thank you very much. That concludes our presentation, and we'll stay online to answer any questions you might have. And I think I'll have some more coffee. Any more questions? Questions about DevExpress controls? Yes, they work on both client and server side. One component that wasn't on that list is an upload control. And this does, small files. It does large files with chunk uploading to a web API. It has events that you can handle when the file was uploaded. All of that stuff. Really, really great controls. They've got a great team. Carl, we are before a crucial decision. Start new project in Blazor WebAssembly or not. What is your suggestion? Deadline for project is end of year. Um, I am available for consulting. Carl at appvnext.com. Obviously, there isn't an answer that I can give you without understanding what exactly you are doing or trying to do. So send me an email, and I'd be happy to work with you guys. Is it okay to make videos about these controls? Absolutely. I mean, I can't speak for DevExpress, but I think they'd be delighted if you made videos about their controls. Welcome. Jorge, I want to learn Blazor. What is the best option? Um, well, you can download the materials that I provided in, on the website. And there's a hands-on lab that will take you through developing that banned Booker application that I showed, complete with the authentication and everything. So that is probably your best bet because it walks you through step by step and explains everything. Am I doing anything with mobile binding yet? No, I'm not. But I didn't even talk about that. I should. The mobile bindings it's currently a sort of a preview alpha thing where you can build, for instance, Xamarin Forms apps using the Blazor component model. So you do the markup with Xamarin Forms markup, but all of your code is essentially Blazor components. Also, to learn Blazor, you can go to the DevExpress website. The Blazor website, they have tutorials for learning Blazor as well, video tutorials and everything else. When will all DevExpress components be in Blazor? That's for DevExpress to answer. Oh, and by the way, people were asking on the roadshow, are there any examples of applications that are public facing that are written in Blazor? And yeah, one is the DevExpress app, the DevExpress website, all those Blazor demos. And if you're really interested, in getting involved, go and download the DevExpress controls and provide your feedback. If you have suggestions, um, we're still in the stage of there's still time to change things. That's what I'm saying, and add new things. But it's great stuff. I've been using them in my projects that I do for myself. For example, the podcast production app that I have uses DevExpress controls. It's only used by me and Richard and Brandon, but we use it. It's great. All right. Well, I think that's it. So we're going to stop streaming, and we'll be back to do this again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Have a good day, guys.